History is full of names. We all recognize: Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal commanders, whose exploits echo through the ages. But what about the others? The brilliant strategists, the daring leaders, the unsung heroes whose victories were just as monumental, yet whose stories have slipped through the cracks of time. Picture this: a battlefield where the fate of empires hung in the balance, led by a commander whose name you've never heard. How could someone so extraordinary vanish from the history books? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 20 legendary commanders of the ancient world, men and women who shaped the course of history but were forgotten by it. Their tales are not just footnotes, they're epic sagas of courage, cunning, and sheer audacity. Think about the last great war movie you watched, or the history lesson that left you on the edge of your seat. Now imagine discovering that the most jaw-dropping strategies, the most against all odds victories, were achieved by leaders whose names have been erased. These were masters of deception, innovators of tactics, and architects of empires that once dominated the ancient world. Some rose from obscurity to topple superpowers. Others defended their homelands with such ferocity that their enemies wrote them out of history out of sheer embarrassment. Why were they forgotten? Sometimes it was politics. Sometimes it was sheer bad luck, but their legacies are still there, waiting to be rediscovered. This isn't just a list, it's a journey into the heart of ancient warfare, where every battle tells a story of ambition, betrayal, and brilliance. You'll meet commanders who outwitted armies 10 times their size, leaders who turned certain defeat into stunning victory, and visionaries whose strategies are still studied by military minds today. By the time we're done, you'll wonder how these names ever faded from memory. So strap in, because history is about to get a lot more exciting. The shadows of the past are hiding legends, and it's time to bring them into the light. Hano the Great, a name that should be as legendary as Hannibal or Scipio, yet somehow slipped through the gaps of history. This was the Carthaginian admiral who commanded the waves long before Rome dreamed of naval supremacy. Picture a time when Carthage was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, its fleets a terrifying force that could strike anywhere, anytime. At the helm of this maritime empire was Hano, a strategist so brilliant that his tactics reshaped naval warfare itself. His secret: innovation. While others relied on brute force, Hano engineered fleets that moved with precision, using currents, wind patterns, and even psychological warfare to outmaneuver enemies. One of his most famous victories came against the Greek fleets off Sicily, where he lured larger, heavier ships into shallow waters, rendering them helpless before cutting them apart with smaller, faster vessels. It was a masterclass in turning an opponent's strength into their greatest weakness, but Hano's genius wasn't limited to battle. He understood that control of the sea meant control of trade, and under his command, Carthage's wealth soared. His expeditions secured vital routes, established colonies, and brought back riches that fueled Carthage's golden age. So why don't we hear about him today? The answer lies in the very politics he helped elevate. When Carthage eventually fell to Rome, the victors rewrote history, diminishing Carthaginian heroes to justify their conquest. Later, even Carthage's own records were lost, burned, buried, or simply forgotten. But fragments remain. Ancient historians like Polybius hint at Hano's prowess, describing battles where he seemed to defy the impossible. And if you look closely at Rome's later naval strategies, you can see echoes of his methods, proof that his legacy outlasted his name. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Hano's story mirrors so many others' brilliance overshadowed by time, erased by the winners of history. Yet his influence lingers. modern admirals still study his principles of mobility and surprise, and historians piece together his campaigns like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Hano wasn't just a commander, he was a visionary who saw the sea not as a barrier but as a highway to power. And though his name faded, the waves he once ruled remember. Thutmose III wasn't just another pharaoh, he was a military genius who transformed Egypt into an empire stretching from the Euphrates to Sudan. A conqueror so relentless historians later called him Egypt's Napoleon. Yet today, his name doesn't carry the weight it should. Why? Because history has a way of burying even the brightest stars under the dust of time, and in Thutmose's case, under the long shadow of his stepmother, the famous Queen Hatshepsut. But make no mistake, while Hatshepsut ruled in peace, Thutmose fought like a storm, waging 17 campaigns without a single defeat, his masterpiece. The Battle of Megiddo, a clash so brilliantly executed it's still taught in war colleges 2,500 years later. Picture this, a coalition of rebellious kings, confident behind Megiddo's towering walls, awaiting Thutmose's army on the obvious route through the valley. But Thutmose didn't play by their rules. Instead of taking the expected path, he led his forces through the treacherous Aruna Pass, a narrow, winding mountain trail where single file was the only option. His generals begged him to reconsider. One misstep and his entire army could be picked off like fruit from a vine, but Thutmose knew the power of surprise. Emerging from the pass like a dagger to the enemy's flank, he caught the rebels utterly unprepared. They fled back to Megiddo in chaos, abandoning their chariots and weapons in such haste that historians say the Egyptian soldiers stopped to loot instead of pursuing, the only mistake in an otherwise flawless victory. That day, Thutmose didn't just win a battle, he rewrote the playbook on deception and audacity. Yet for all his triumphs, Thutmose's legacy faced an unexpected enemy, politics. After Hatshepsut's death, her successors systematically erased her monuments and inscriptions, but in the process, Thutmose's own reign became tangled in the chaos of historical revision. Later Egyptologists, dazzled by Hatshepsut's rare female rulership, often focused on her at Thutmose's expense. Even the artifacts tell a story of neglect. Many of his inscriptions were reused or buried, his statues lost to time. But the evidence of his brilliance remains. The annals of his campaigns, meticulously recorded on temple walls at Karnak, reveal a leader who combined brute force with psychological cunning. He didn't just conquer cities, he shattered alliances, turning enemies against each other with promises of mercy for those who surrendered and ruthless punishment for those who resisted. What's most astonishing is how modern his strategies feel. Thutmose understood supply lines, intelligence gathering, and the morale of his troops, concepts we associate with generals centuries later. He built fortresses to secure his gains, appointed loyal vassals to govern conquered lands, and even used captured princes as hostages to ensure their father's obedience. His empire didn't just grow, it endured. So why isn't he a household name? Perhaps because history favors flashy narratives over steady competence. Thutmose wasn't just a warrior, he was an administrator, a nation builder who spent more years consolidating his gains than fighting. But in an age where empires rose and fell like tides, his record stands unmatched. A pharaoh who never lost, whose tactics echoed through the ages, and whose shadow, though faded, still stretches across the annals of war. Chandragupta Maurya may have worn the crown, but behind every great emperor stands an even greater strategist, and in this case, it was a man named Bindusara, the ruthless architect of India's first empire. While history books celebrate Chandragupta as the founder of the Mauryan dynasty, few remember the mastermind who turned rebellion into reign, the shadowy figure who crafted the spy networks and psychological tricks that shattered the mighty Nanda dynasty. This wasn't just conquest, it was a revolution, and Bindusara's fingerprints were all over it. Imagine a kingdom so wealthy its palaces had floors polished with mercury, so powerful its army dwarfed all rivals. The Nandas ruled such an empire. To challenge them wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. Yet Bindusara saw weakness in their strength. Their people despised them, taxed into poverty, while the nobility lived in obscene luxury. So he didn't just raise an army, he weaponized discontent. His spies infiltrated every level of Nanda society, spreading whispers of rebellion, bribing officials, and even posing as merchants to map enemy supply lines. By the time Chandragupta's forces marched, the Nandas were already crumbling from within. But Bindusara's true brilliance lay in what happened next. The final assault wasn't a head-on clash, it was a masterpiece of misdirection. Bindusara fed the Nanda generals false intelligence, convincing them the attack would come from the east. When their forces rushed to defend the wrong frontier, Chandragupta's army struck the undefended capital like a thunderbolt. But even victory wasn't enough for Bindusara. To ensure no rebellion could rise, he staged a chilling spectacle, executing the entire Nanda royal family in public, a grim warning to anyone who dared resist the new order. It was brutality with a purpose, terror as statecraft. So why is Bindusara's name lost to history? Partly because Chandragupta, like all rulers, preferred to claim glory for himself. But there's another reason. Bindusara's methods were too dark, too uncomfortable for later chroniclers to celebrate. Where kings wanted tales of divine right and noble conquest, Bindusara's legacy was one of deception, espionage, and cold calculation. Yet his influence echoes through the ages. The Mauryan Empire's infamous spy network, the very model for ancient intelligence agencies, was his creation. Even the famed advisor Chanakya, often credited as the empire's brain, relied on Bindusara's web of informants. The irony, Bindusara's greatest triumph was making himself obsolete. Once the empire was secure, his brand of ruthless pragmatism became a liability. Emperors needed to be seen as just not schemers, and so the man who built the machine was quietly erased from its official history. But in the dusty pages of lesser-known texts, in the tactics later used by kings and conquerors, his ghost lingers. Bindusara proved that wars aren't just won on battlefields, they're won in the shadows where fear and cunning meet. And though his name faded, his playbook never did. Queen Teuta of Illyria wasn't just a ruler, she was a storm in human form, a pirate queen whose very name sent shivers down the spine of Rome. At a time when women were expected to wield influence from the shadows, Teuta seized power openly, commanding fleets that turned the Adriatic into her personal hunting ground. Her story begins with tragedy. The death of her husband, King Agron, left Illyria vulnerable, its enemies circling like vultures, but Teuta refused to play the grieving widow. Instead, she donned the mantle of leadership with a ferocity that stunned the ancient world. Under her rule, Illyrian pirates became the terror of the Mediterranean, raiding Roman ships with such audacity that the Republic's merchants begged the Senate for protection. This wasn't just piracy, it was a calculated strategy to strangle Rome's trade routes, and for a time it worked brilliantly. What made Teuta so formidable? She understood the power of asymmetry. While Rome relied on brute force and formal battles, Teuta's forces struck like ghosts, swift, unpredictable, vanishing into the maze of Illyria's rocky coastlines before retaliation could come. Her captains, loyal to the point of fanaticism, operated like a network of independent cells, making it impossible for Rome to decapitate the rebellion with a single blow. And when the Republic finally sent envoys to demand she curb the raids, Teuta's response became legendary. According to the historian Polybius, she scoffed at their threats, declaring that piracy was Illyria's ancient right, and then, in a move that shocked even her own advisors, had one of the envoys executed. It was a declaration of war wrapped in an insult, and Rome's pride couldn't let it stand. The resulting conflict revealed Teuta's second genius, turning weakness into strength. Illyria's navy was no match for Rome's in open water, so she refused to give them a clean fight. Instead, she lured Roman ships into narrow straits where their numbers meant nothing, using fire ships and ambushes to scatter their formations. For 2 years, she held the mightiest empire of the age at bay, a feat no other adversary had managed. But Rome's resources were endless, and Teuta's luck ran out when betrayal from within forced her surrender. Even in defeat, though, she dictated terms keeping her throne, though her power was clipped. The real mystery isn't how Teuta fell, but why her story was erased. Rome couldn't bear to admit a woman had humiliated them, so they painted her as a barbarian, a footnote in their march to dominance. Yet her tactics lived on. Centuries later, admirals would rediscover her principles of hit-and-run warfare, and her defiance became a blueprint for underdog nations facing giants. Teuta proved that sometimes the sharpest sword isn't steel, it's sheer, unapologetic audacity, and though Rome tried to bury her name, the Adriatic's waves still whisper it. Viriathus didn't need a royal bloodline or a vast army to become Rome's knight, just a shepherd's cunning and a rebel's fury. In the rugged mountains of Lusitania, modern-day Portugal, this former shepherd-turned-guerrilla leader waged a war so devastating that Roman generals called him the Spanish Hannibal. For 10 grueling years, he outmaneuvered the mightiest military machine of the ancient world, proving that brilliance could trump brute force. While Spartacus's revolt lasted 2 years, Viriathus held Rome at bay for a decade. His tactics so effective they became a blueprint for resistance movements centuries later. So why does history remember one name and forget the other? The answer lies in Viriathus's mastery of terrain and psychology. Rome's legions were unstoppable in open battle, but in the jagged hills of Lusitania, their formations meant nothing. Viriathus knew every ravine, every hidden pass, and he used them like weapons. His fighters would strike like lightning, ambushing supply convoys, cutting communication lines, then vanishing before reinforcements arrived. When pursued, he led Roman troops on exhausting chases through treacherous landscapes, only to double back and attack their now exhausted ranks. One particularly humiliating defeat saw an entire Roman legion lured into a box canyon, where Viriathus's forces rained down arrows and boulders from above. The few survivors staggered back to their camp, demoralized and broken, but Viriathus's real genius was his ability to unite fractious tribes under a single cause. Where other rebels relied on fear or gold, he earned loyalty through shared sacrifice, distributing plunder equally among his followers and fighting alongside them in the dirt. Even captured Roman soldiers admitted his fairness, a stark contrast to the corruption they knew at home. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a people's war, and it terrified Rome. The Senate grew so desperate they resorted to dishonor, offering Viriathus a peace treaty, then breaking it the moment his guard was down. When that failed, they turned to betrayal. 3 of his own companions, bribed with promises of Roman citizenship, assassinated him as he slept. The irony, Rome's greatest victory over him came not on the battlefield, but through a dagger in the dark. Yet Viriathus's legacy refused to die. His fighters, instead of surrendering, redoubled their efforts, forcing Rome to grant the very freedoms their leader had fought for. So why isn't his name as famous as Spartacus's? Blame the storytellers. Spartacus's revolt fit neatly into Rome's narrative of gladiator spectacles and slave uprisings, a thrilling but ultimately doomed struggle. Viriathus, though, exposed Rome's fragility, proving even an empire could be bled dry by a determined underdog. That was a truth too uncomfortable to celebrate. But in the hills of Lusitania, in the tactics of every guerrilla fighter who followed, his spirit endured. Viriathus didn't just resist Rome, he taught the world how to defy giants. Zhang Liang wasn't just a strategist, he was a philosopher who turned thought into conquest. A mind so sharp he outmaneuvered an empire with nothing but a beggar's disguise and a handful of clever words. While history remembers Liu Bang as the founder of China's Han Dynasty, it was Zhang Liang who orchestrated the fall of the Qin, weaving webs of deception so intricate they could have been lifted straight from Sun Tzu's playbook. His greatest weapon, understanding human nature. Take the infamous incident at Yi Bridge, where a single meal changed the course of history. Disguised as a frail old man, Zhang Liang approached the Qin's most ruthless general and offered him a humble gift of rice. It seemed like nothing until the general realized too late that the beggar had just poisoned his trust. Within weeks, the general defected, taking his army with him and leaving the Qin vulnerable. This was Zhang Liang's genius. He didn't just defeat enemies, he made them defeat themselves. But his most daring move came during the siege of Xianyang, the Qin capital. The city's walls were impregnable, its defenders prepared for a bloody assault. Zhang Liang, however, had no intention of storming the gates. Instead, he spread rumors among the Qin troops that their emperor had already surrendered, that resistance was futile. Panic spread like wildfire. By the time Liu Bang's forces arrived, the gates were thrown open from within. Yet for all his brilliance, Zhang Liang's story takes a baffling turn. At the height of his influence, with wealth and power at his fingertips, he vanished, abandoning court life to wander the mountains as a hermit. Some say he sought immortality. Others whisper he'd grown disillusioned with the very empire he'd helped create. The truth might lie in his philosophy. Zhang Liang studied the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, action through inaction. He knew when to push and, more importantly, when to let go. While lesser men clung to power until it destroyed them, he walked away, leaving behind legends instead of scandals. Even in disappearance, he outplayed everyone. Later Han rulers, desperate for his counsel, sent search parties across China, but he was never found. Perhaps that was his final lesson. The greatest strategist isn't the one who holds the throne, but the one who knows how to leave it. And though his name faded next to emperors and kings, his tactics didn't. Centuries later, generals would still pore over his campaigns, marveling at the mind that conquered an empire without ever swinging a sword. While Boudica's fiery rebellion burns bright in history, her contemporary Queen Carthaginian of the Brigantes chose a path so cunning it's often mistaken for cowardice. Ruling the largest tribe in northern Britannia, Carthaginian faced the same Roman invasion, but where Boudica saw an enemy to destroy, she saw a predator to tame. This wasn't betrayal, it was survival chess. The Brigantes' land stretched from sea to sea, a prize both Rome and rival tribes craved. Open war would have shattered her people. So Carthaginian played a longer game, becoming Rome's ally while keeping her throne and her tribe intact. Her secret, understanding power isn't just about defiance, it's about knowing when to grip and when to let go. Take the stunning moment she handed over the fugitive Caratacus, Britain's most defiant resistance leader, to the Romans in golden chains. To her enemies, it was treason. To Carthaginian, it was pure calculation. By delivering Rome's most wanted, she bought her kingdom decades of favor, tax breaks, military support, and a free hand to rule as she pleased. Meanwhile, Boudica's revolt left her people slaughtered and her land salted. Yet Carthaginan's brilliance went deeper. She didn't just collaborate, she manipulated. When her husband Venutius tried to rally anti-Roman sentiment, she divorced him and married his armor-bearer, a scandal so delicious it split the tribal elite. Rome, amused by the chaos, backed her moves, unaware she was using their support to purge her rivals. But pragmatism has its price. As Roman grip tightened, Carthagin's balancing act crumbled. Venutius, now her sworn enemy, launched a revolt so fierce even Rome's legions struggled to save her. The final humiliation, fleeing her own kingdom under guard, a queen without a crown. Yet her legacy lingers in the quiet truth she proved. Sometimes the sharpest resistance isn't a sword, it's a smile that hides a knife. While Boudica became a symbol of doomed heroism, Carthagin's tribe survived, even thrived under Roman rule. History judges her harshly for lacking Boudica's blaze, but her people might say she gave them something rarer, a future. Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix didn't just play the game of power, he rewrote the rules with a dagger in one hand and a ledger in the other. Long before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Sulla showed Rome what happened when a general decided the Republic wasn't sacred, just inconvenient. This was a man who marched his legions into Rome itself not once, but twice, shattering centuries of tradition that forbade armies within the city's sacred boundary. His weapon of choice, the proscription list, a bureaucratic nightmare scrawled with the names of his enemies, their property marked for seizure, their lives forfeit. But what made Sulla truly terrifying wasn't the bloodshed, it was the cold precision of it. While others killed in fits of rage, he turned murder into policy, auctioning off the estates of the condemned to fund his own war chest. The Forum became a marketplace of death, where citizens scrambled to buy their neighbors' confiscated villas at bargain prices. Yet beneath the brutality lay a twisted vision of reform. Sulla didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to remake it, stripping power from the populist tribunes and handing it back to the Senate, a Senate he packed with loyalists, of course. His military reforms were equally calculated. By tying soldiers' pensions directly to their general's success, he created armies loyal to commanders over the state, planting the seeds for the civil wars that would later tear Rome apart. The irony, Sulla's obsession with restoring the Republic's old order ended up making its collapse inevitable. He proved that with enough swords, even tradition could be rewritten. So why does history remember Caesar as the tyrant and Sulla as a stern reformer? Partly because Sulla did the unthinkable. He retired. After piling Rome's streets with corpses, he stepped down, retired to his villa, and reportedly spent his final days writing memoirs and hosting debauched parties. It was as if the wolf had voluntarily put itself back in the cage, letting later historians paint him as a man who used violence for a greater good, but the truth lingers in the aftermath. The precedents he set, the march on Rome, the proscriptions, the personal armies became the playbook for every ambitious warlord who followed. Sulla didn't just wield power, he weaponized it, leaving behind a republic so hollowed out that when Caesar came knocking, the doors practically fell off their hinges. His legacy wasn't stability, it was a warning written in blood and ignored at Rome's peril. Tiridates I didn't just defy Rome, he made an empire grovel at his feet, then walked away with a crown and a standing ovation. At a time when client kings bowed to Caesar's whims, this Armenian ruler turned the tables so completely that Nero, of all emperors, had to stage a spectacle just to save face. The story begins in the jagged peaks of the Armenian highlands, where Tiridates mastered a style of warfare Rome could never conquer. His cavalry, lightning fast and fueled by generations of mountain combat, struck without warning, fading into the rocks like ghosts. Supply lines, Tiridates didn't need them, his fighters lived off the land, while Roman legions, weighed down by armor and arrogance, starved in the passes. When General Corbulo finally led Rome's finest into Armenia, he found only scorched earth and ambushes. The campaign dragged on for years, draining imperial coffers and morale until Nero faced an unthinkable choice: keep throwing legions into the meat grinder or negotiate. What happened next was pure political theater, with Tiridates as the star. Rome couldn't admit defeat, so they staged a surrender that was anything but. Invited to the capital as a guest, Tiridates arrived like a conqueror, his entourage dripping in silk and gold. The climax, a ceremony where Nero, dressed as the sun god Apollo, granted Tiridates his own crown as if it were a gift, not a hard-won concession. The crowd cheered, the poets sang, and the records carefully omitted that Rome had just ratified what it couldn't win on the battlefield: Armenian independence. So why does Carrie echo through history while Tiridates' victory gathers dust? Simple. Rome knew how to spin a story. Crassus's defeat at Carrie was a disaster too spectacular to hide: legions lost, eagles captured, a consul's head used as a prop in a Parthian play. But Tiridates' triumph, that could be repackaged as a Roman diplomatic triumph, a carefully choreographed farce where everyone pretended Nero held the strings. The truth, for all its glitter, that ceremony in Rome was a surrender in reverse, proof that even emperors could be outmaneuvered by a king who knew the value of patience, terrain, and the perfect exit. And though his name faded, his lesson didn't. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't just won on the battlefield, they're won in the theater of power, where perception is the sharpest sword. Queen Ammonionas of Kush wasn't just a ruler, she was a force of nature, a one-eyed warrior queen who stared down Rome and made an emperor blink. At a time when the Mediterranean world trembled before Augustus's legions, Ammonionas did the unthinkable: she struck first. Picture the scene: Roman forts dotting the Nile's lush borderlands, symbols of an empire that had never known defeat. Then, like a sandstorm roaring out of the desert, came the Kushites. Ammonionas, leading from the front despite having lost an eye in battle years earlier, didn't just attack. She erased those forts from the map, burning them to the ground and hauling Augustus's statues back to Kush as trophies. This wasn't just a raid, it was a statement. Rome had ventured into lands where even their gods held no sway, and Ammonionas was there to remind them. Her brilliance lay in understanding what Rome couldn't grasp: the desert was her ally. While legions drilled for open-field combat, Kushite warriors moved like shadows, using the Nubian sands as both shield and weapon. They struck at dawn when the heat hadn't yet sapped their strength, vanishing before reinforcements could arrive, Ammonionas's masterstroke targeting the granaries. By destroying Rome's food stores, she turned their own supply lines against them, forcing hungry soldiers to march into ambushes on empty stomachs. But her boldest move came after the initial victories. Instead of retreating to celebrate, she pushed north, sacking the wealthy city of Aswan and sending shockwaves through the empire. Augustus, embroiled in political dramas back home, suddenly faced a crisis no amount of propaganda could spin. A queen from the edge of the known world had humiliated his frontier forces. The war dragged on for years, a grueling stalemate that cost Rome dearly. Finally, in a moment historians still debate, Augustus did something unprecedented. He offered peace, and not just any peace, a treaty that included Roman tribute to Kush. No reparations, no demands for land, just a quiet agreement to withdraw and pay Ammonionas for her trouble. It was a diplomatic fig leaf, of course, a way for Augustus to save face while cutting his losses. But the message was clear: Kush had fought Rome to a standstill, and its queen had won. Why isn't this story as famous as Cleopatra's? Because Rome couldn't bear to immortalize a defeat at the hands of a woman they dismissed as a barbarian. Ammonionas's victory was scrubbed from official records, reduced to vague mentions of troubles in the south. Even the statues she stole were buried by embarrassed officials. only rediscovered centuries later. Yet her legacy endures in the echoes of resistance, proof that even the mightiest empire could be humbled by a leader who knew her land, her people, and the power of perfect timing. Amanianas didn't just fight Rome, she outfought them, and walked away with their gold. And though her name faded in the west, in the sands of Nubia, her legend still burns as bright as the fort she left in ashes. Critignatus wasn't just Vercingetorix's cousin, he was the dark genius behind Gaul's last stand, a tactician so ruthless even Caesar knew his name had to be erased. While history immortalizes Vercingetorix as the face of Gallic resistance, it was Critignatus who devised the harrowing strategy that nearly broke Rome's grip on Illyria. Picture the scene: 80,000 Gauls trapped inside the fortress, Roman siege walls tightening like a noose, supplies dwindling to nothing. Vercingetorix ordered the women and children expelled to save food, but Critignatus saw further. In a speech so chilling it still echoes through fragments of Caesar's own journals, he proposed a last resort survival through cannibalism. This wasn't madness, it was calculus. The weak would sustain the strong, buying time for reinforcements to shatter Caesar's lines from outside. What made Critignatus terrifying wasn't the grim logic of his plan, but the loyalty it inspired. His words weren't met with horror, but with solemn agreement. These were men willing to cross every line for freedom, and Critignatus understood something Caesar didn't. An enemy with nothing left to lose is unstoppable. The siege of Illyria became a battle of wills, and for weeks, Critignatus's defiance held Gaul together. Even as starvation gnawed at them, his warriors fought with a ferocity that forced Caesar to double his fortifications, fearing a breakout. But history is written by the victors, and Rome couldn't afford to immortalize a man who turned desperation into a weapon. Caesar's accounts, our primary source for the rebellion, diminish Critignatus to a footnote, painting him as a fanatic rather than the strategic mastermind he was. The truth, his very existence undermined Caesar's propaganda. The conqueror wanted Gaul remembered as a noble but doomed uprising, not a movement that birthed tacticians capable of outthinking Rome. So Critignatus vanished, his name scrubbed from monuments, his speech reduced to a grotesque anecdote. Yet his shadow lingers. Modern scholars piecing together Celtic oral traditions find whispers of a raven strategist who counseled sacrifice, and rebel movements from Masada to Stalingrad would later echo his brutal calculus, proving that even erased, some ideas refused to die. Critignatus wasn't just forgotten, he was deliberately buried because Rome knew the most dangerous rebels aren't the ones who fight. They're the ones who make others believe victory is worth any price. Masistius wasn't just another Persian noble. He was the razor's edge of Xerxes' invasion force, a cavalry commander so feared the Greeks called him the man who couldn't be unhorsed. At the Battle of Plataea, his elite horsemen came within a hair's breadth of dismantling Greece's last stand, proving that Persia's strength wasn't just in numbers, but in precision. Clad in golden scale armor, leading a corps of the empire's finest riders, Masistius turned the rolling plains into a killing field. His tactics were brutal in their simplicity. Lightning-fast charges aimed not at breaking infantry lines, but at shredding their cohesion. Wave after wave of arrows and javelins would rain down, then, before the Greeks could regroup, his horsemen would wheel away, leaving chaos in their wake. For days, this dance of death whittled down the Allied forces, and the Greeks had no answer. Their heavy hoplites, masters of the phalanx, were useless against an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Then came the pivotal moment, a gamble that should have sealed Greece's fate. Spotting a gap in the Greek lines, Masistius led a charge straight into their heart, aiming to split their army in two. But this time the Greeks were ready. A well-placed javelin struck his horse, sending the legendary commander crashing to the ground. What happened next was pure instinct. Instead of fleeing, Mecistius fought on foot, his armor deflecting blow after blow until an Athenian soldier found the one weak spot: his eye. His death sent shockwaves through both armies. The Persians, demoralized by the loss of their champion, launched a disorganized assault that played right into Greek hands. The tide turned that day not because of some grand strategy, but because one man's legend had outgrown his caution. The irony: Mecistius's fatal charge was the exact maneuver that had won Persia countless battles. His aggression was his trademark, the reason Xerxes trusted him with the empire's most elite troops. But at Plataea, that same aggression became a liability. Without him, the Persian cavalry lost its nerve, its coordination, and with it, the battle. Greece survived to forge its golden age, while Persia's grip on the West began to slip. Historians love debating what-ifs, but here's the chilling truth: had Mecistius lived, the world might never have known Athenian democracy, Spartan defiance, or the cultural explosion that followed. His fall wasn't just a turning point, it was the hinge on which ancient history swung. And though his name faded next to Xerxes or Leonidas, his legacy lingers in the unspoken rule of war. Even the mightiest blade can snap if pushed too far. Hasdrubal the Fair wasn't just Hannibal's brother-in-law, he was the unsung architect of Carthage's Spanish Empire, a visionary who understood that gold and silver alone couldn't sustain conquest. While Hannibal would later become the face of Carthage's defiance against Rome, it was Hasdrubal who laid the foundation, transforming Iberia from a wild frontier into a thriving colonial powerhouse. His strategy, diplomacy as sharp as any sword. Where other conquerors ruled through terror, Hasdrubal married into local tribes, forged alliances with Celtiberian chieftains, and even minted coins bearing their symbols alongside Carthaginian gods. This wasn't just occupation, it was integration, a blueprint for empire building so effective that Rome would later copy it wholesale. But his true masterstroke was New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena, a city positioned like a dagger pointing at Rome's underbelly. With its deep water harbor and silver mines bankrolling Carthage armies, it became the beating heart of their resistance. Hasdrubal didn't just want resources, he wanted a launch pad. And that's what terrified Rome. While they were busy patting themselves down after the First Punic War, Hasdrubal was quietly turning Spain into a war machine, recruiting and training the very troops Hannibal would later lead across the Alps. The irony: his greatest achievement, stability, made him a target. Roman spies couldn't destabilize a region united under his rule, so they resorted to something darker: assassination. A lone Iberian mercenary, likely bribed by Roman agents, stabbed Hasdrubal in his own tent, leaving Carthage's Spanish holdings teetering on chaos. The question that haunts historians isn't just how he died, but what might have been. Had Hasdrubal lived to join Hannibal's march, the brother-in-laws could have executed a pincer move no Roman general could counter. Imagine Hannibal descending from the Alps while Hasdrubal marched up from Spain, squeezing Rome between them like an anvil and hammer. Instead, his successor fumbled, delaying reinforcements until it was too late. By the time Hannibal got his wish, a second army at his back, Rome had already rallied, crushing Hasdrubal's forces at the Meteorus River and tossing his severed head into Hannibal's camp. The message was clear: without its architect, Carthage's empire was a house of cards. Rome's fear of Hasdrubal tells you everything. They didn't just erase him, they replaced his legacy with Hannibal's, turning the younger Barca into a lone genius rather than part of a strategic dynasty. But the clues remain. The treaties Hasdrubal signed with Spanish tribes outlasted Carthage itself, and the silver that fueled Hannibal's war, that was Hasdrubal's doing. His death wasn't just a loss, it was the moment Carthage's fate tilted toward ruin. Because empires aren't just built on battles, they're built on minds, and Rome knew it had eliminated the sharpest one Carthage ever had. Perseus of Macedon wasn't just a king, he was a ghost of Alexander's legacy, a ruler who came agonizingly close to stitching his fractured homeland back into an empire. By the time he took the throne, Macedon was a shadow of its former glory, squeezed between Rome's rising power and the squabbling Greek city-states, but Perseus had a plan. While Rome expected him to rattle sabers, he quietly waged a different kind of war, one fought with coins, not swords. His treasury, rumored to overflow with gold, wasn't just wealth, it was a weapon. He bankrolled rebellions in Roman client states, subsidized grain shortages to win populist support, and even bribed Roman allies to switch sides. This wasn't conquest, it was economic subversion, and for a while it worked brilliantly. Rome's reaction tells you everything. Instead of dismissing him as a petty king, they painted Perseus as a monster, a tyrant plotting to enslave Greece anew. Their propaganda machine went into overdrive, accusing him of everything from poisoning diplomats to plotting assassinations. Why the hysteria? Because Perseus had exposed Rome's weakest flank, their reliance on client kingdoms. If Macedon could destabilize the region with gold instead of legions, others might follow. The Senate couldn't risk that precedent, so they manufactured a casus belli, declaring war not because Perseus had attacked, but because he'd proven too clever to ignore. The Battle of Pydna should have been his triumph. Outnumbered and outflanked, Perseus's phalanx initially held firm against the Roman onslaught, their sarissas forming an impenetrable forest of steel. But then fate twisted. A misstep in the rough terrain broke their formation, and the legionaries poured through the gaps like water through cracks. Perseus, watching his dream collapse, did the unthinkable. He fled. To the Romans, this was proof of his cowardice. To the Macedonians, it was pragmatism. A dead king couldn't rally a resistance, and Perseus knew his value as a living symbol. Yet Rome made sure that symbol was tarnished. They paraded him through the streets in chains, then erased his treasury from history, melting his coins into bland Roman currency. The myth of Macedon's wealth wasn't just plunder, it was rewritten, a deliberate act of historical vandalism to convince the world Perseus had never been a threat. But the truth lingers in the fragments. Roman records grudgingly admit how much effort it took to defeat him, how many allies he'd swayed before the war. Even in exile, Perseus unnerved them. Legends say he died forgotten in a Roman prison, but his real end was quieter. A king who understood power isn't just taken, it's bought, and whose only crime was teaching Rome a lesson they couldn't afford to remember. Jugurtha didn't just fight Rome, he exposed its rotting core, turning a war for Numidia into a spectacle of senatorial greed so blatant even the gods might have blushed. This wasn't just a king defending his throne, it was a masterclass in how to weaponize corruption. Born a nephew to the Numidian ruler, Jugurtha seized power through a mix of charisma and cold-blooded strategy, assassinating rivals and outmaneuvering Rome's puppet candidates. But his real genius lay in understanding something shocking. Rome's politicians had a price, and it wasn't as high as anyone thought. When the Senate sent armies to depose him, Jugurtha didn't just meet them on the battlefield. He met them in backrooms, slipping gold into the right hands until entire legions marched in circles. At one point, he reportedly walked into the Senate itself, looked around and sneered. A city for sale if it ever finds a buyer. The insult stung because it was true. Yet behind the bribery lay a military mind Rome underestimated. Jugurtha's desert campaigns were nightmares of asymmetry. His light cavalry, born in the Sahara's furnace, could strike Roman supply lines and vanish into the dunes before heavy infantry could react. He turned the arid landscape into an ally, luring legions into waterless wastes where heat and thirst did his killing for him. At the siege of Teuta, he didn't bother storming the walls. He starved the city into surrender, then used its fall as propaganda to rally more tribes to his side. This wasn't just war, it was psychological theater, and for years Rome's best generals looked like fools chasing shadows. The turning point came not from battle, but betrayal. Jugurtha's father-in-law, King Bocchus of Mauritania, secretly cut a deal with Rome, luring him to a parley where Roman soldiers ambushed him in chains. The irony, Bocchus didn't even get the full reward Rome stiffed him on half the payment. But Jugurtha's downfall had unintended consequences. His war laid bare the Senate's incompetence and corruption, fueling public outrage that a barbarian king had outplayed them so thoroughly. Enter Gaius Marius, a populist general who seized on the scandal to overhaul Rome's military. The Marian reforms recruiting landless poor, standardizing equipment, offering pensions, were born from the humiliation Jugurtha inflicted. Suddenly, Rome's army wasn't a plaything for aristocrats. It was a professional force, and it would soon reshape the Mediterranean. Jugurtha's legacy is a paradox. The man who exposed Rome's weakness made it stronger. His war proved money could buy senators, but not victory, and in the end, Rome learned that lesson better than he did. Dragged through the streets in Marius's triumph, he died in a prison cell, forgotten by all but the historians who preserved his mocking words. Yet his ghost lingered. For centuries after, any scandal involving bribes was called Jugurthine, a bitter joke about the king who proved even empires have their price. Neoptolemus wasn't just Mithridates' admiral, he was Rome's nightmare at sea, a tactician who turned the Aegean into a graveyard of shattered galleys. While Mithridates VI waged war on land, Neoptolemus rewrote the rules of naval combat, proving Rome's legendary legions were useless against a commander who ruled the waves. His masterpiece, the Battle of Tenedos, where he didn't just defeat a Roman fleet, he annihilated it. The secret lay in his brutal innovations: ships rigged with grappling hooks to immobilize enemies, archers trained to target rowers, and most terrifying of all, the infamous sea fire. This wasn't ordinary flame. It was a concoction of pitch, sulfur, and naphtha that clung to wood and flesh alike, turning ships into floating pyres. Roman sailors, conditioned to ram and board, had no defense against an enemy who burned them alive before they could close the gap. But Neoptolemus's true genius was psychological. He understood Rome's navy was an afterthought, a tool for transport rather than true warfare. So he struck where they were weakest, their pride. After Tenedos, he sailed unchallenged along the Anatolian coast, torching supply ports and severing Rome's lifelines to the east. Each victory was a spectacle designed to humiliate. One account describes him towing captured ships behind his fleet like macabre trophies, their charred hulls a warning to any captain foolish enough to challenge him. The Senate, accustomed to land-based glory, found itself paralyzed. How do you defeat an enemy whose battlefield literally vanishes beneath him? Then came the twist even Neoptolemus couldn't outmaneuver: poison. Mithridates, ever paranoid, grew suspicious of his admiral's rising fame. The king, who famously ingested small doses of toxins to build immunity, allegedly gifted his naval commander a victory feast laced with a lethal dose. The irony was cruel. The man who'd escaped Rome's fleets couldn't escape his own king's distrust. Yet his legacy outlived the betrayal. Rome, traumatized by his tactics, would later adopt his sea fire for their own use, and the principles of asymmetrical naval warfare he pioneered resurfaced centuries later in Byzantine and Arab fleets. The real tragedy, Thutmosis' name should be synonymous with naval revolution. Instead, he's a footnote buried under the weight of Mithridate's larger-than-life defiance. But in the charred timbers of Tenedos, in the frantic Roman reforms that followed, his influence burns quietly, proof that sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't those who fight empires head-on, but those who force them to question their own supremacy. Degiz wasn't just Decebalus's advisor, he was the invisible hand behind Dacia's defiance, a spy master so skilled he turned Rome's own arrogance against them. While Trajan's legions marched with the confidence of an empire that had never truly known defeat, Degiz waged a shadow war, proving that information could be deadlier than any gladius. His network stretched like spider silk across the Balkans, smuggling secrets through merchants, bribing Roman clerks to misplace supply requests, and even planting false defectors to feed Trajan's generals' fabricated battle plans. The result, Rome's mighty war machine, usually a model of precision, stumbled into ambush after ambush, its scouts led astray by carefully doctored maps, its messengers intercepted and replaced with doubles carrying deceptive orders. One of Degiz's most devastating ploys targeted Rome's siege engineers. Knowing Trajan relied on their expertise to breach Dacia's mountain fortresses, Degiz had his agents slip flawed blueprints into Roman camps' designs that looked perfect until the siege towers collapsed under their own weight. The delays bought Dacia precious months to stockpile food and forge alliances with neighboring tribes, but Degiz's true masterpiece was psychological. He spread rumors among Roman ranks that Dacian forests were haunted, that their warriors could turn invisible in the mist. Superstition festered and morale plummeted. Soldiers who'd faced Germanic berserkers without flinch now hesitated at the rustle of leaves, their discipline unraveling under the weight of manufactured dread. The betrayal that doomed Degiz wasn't a failure of strategy, it was a failure of trust. Decebalus, increasingly paranoid as Roman noose tightened, began purging his own court, suspecting spies everywhere. In a tragic twist, he ordered Degiz's arrest, convinced his spymaster had been turned by Trajan's gold. The truth, Degiz had been playing his deepest game yet, feigning defection to plant a final, catastrophic lie that Dacia's treasury was hidden in a vulnerable valley. When Trajan took the bait, diverting his forces to seize the prize, Decebalus's army was left exposed. By the time the king realized his mistake, Rome's legions were at the gates of Sarmai's Gattusa. Degiz's legacy is a paradox. His methods delayed Rome's conquest by years, yet his downfall came not from enemy blades, but from the very distrust he'd weaponized against others. In the end, Trajan's column immortalized Dacia's fall, but there's no carving of Degiz, no tribute to the man who proved even empires could be outthought. His war wasn't fought with swords, but with whispers, and though Rome erased his name, the cracks he left in their invincibility lingered. Centuries later, Byzantine emperors would study fragmentary accounts of his tactics, realizing too late that the greatest threats often wear no armor at all. Pacorus I wasn't just another Parthian prince, he was the architect of Rome's most humiliating defeat since Carrhae, a commander who proved cavalry could outthink as well as outrun the mightiest legions. While Crassus's disaster at Carrhae had been a fluke of arrogance and bad terrain, Pacorus's invasion of Syria was something far worse, a calculated dismantling of Roman military doctrine. His army moved like a desert wind, horse archers striking from impossible angles, their arrows finding gaps in armor before the infantry could even raise their shields. This wasn't hit and run. It was a surgical strike designed to expose Rome's fatal weakness, its reliance on static, heavy formations that crumbled when faced with an enemy who refused to stand still. The key to Pacorus's success lay in his understanding of psychological warfare. He didn't just defeat Roman forces, he shattered their morale. After overrunning Syria's undefended cities, he did the unthinkable, he gave them back. Not out of mercy, but to send a message. Rome couldn't hold what it claimed to rule. The tactic was devastating. Local allies, seeing the empire's impotence, defected en masse, while legions sent to reclaim the territory found themselves chasing ghosts. Pacorus's cavalry would appear just long enough to lure them into ambushes, then vanish into the arid landscape, leaving behind only dust and corpses. Even Rome's vaunted siege engines were useless against an enemy with no cities to besiege. Rome's countermeasures bordered on desperation. They recruited their own cavalry from allied tribes, but these auxiliaries lacked the Parthians' lifetime of horseback archery training. They tried lighter armor for mobility, only to discover it couldn't stop Parthian arrows at close range. The Senate even resorted to assassinating Pacorus's allies, a tacit admission that open battle was hopeless. Yet none of it worked until fate intervened in the murkiest way possible. Pacorus's death remains one of history's unsolved puzzles. Some accounts claim he fell in battle against a Roman counterattack. His body never recovered. Others whisper of betrayal, a poisoned arrow from a rival Parthian faction, or even a Roman paid assassin. The most tantalizing theory that he survived, slipping into obscurity to avoid becoming a pawn in Parthia's dynastic scheming. Whatever the truth, his disappearance left a vacuum Rome exploited with unseemly haste, retaking Syria before the Parthians could regroup. But Pacorus's legacy outlived the chaos. His campaigns forced Rome to confront its cavalry problem head-on, leading to the eventual creation of specialized mounted units that would later dominate under emperors like Trajan. Even his tactics endured centuries later. Byzantine generals studied his hit-and-run strategies to repel invaders. The irony, Rome's greatest lesson in humility came not from a king or emperor, but from a prince who understood that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't a sword, but the ground beneath your enemy's feet. Ganymedes wasn't just Cleopatra's tutor. He was the military mind who almost outmaneuvered Julius Caesar himself, a eunuch general whose tactics on the Nile should have rewritten history. While Mark Antony's doomed romance with Cleopatra dominates the story of Egypt's fall, it was Ganymedes who first proved Rome could bleed. Picture the scene: Caesar, fresh from crushing Pompey's forces, expects a quick victory over Egypt's squabbling royals. Instead, he finds himself trapped in Alexandria's palace district, cut off from reinforcements by a naval blockade so tight his men are reduced to drinking seawater. The architect of this nightmare, a former palace tutor turned battlefield savant who understood that Egypt's greatest weapon wasn't its armies, it was the Nile itself. Ganymedes' strategy was brutal in its simplicity. He didn't need to defeat Caesar in open battle, he just needed to wait. Controlling the canals and aqueducts, he turned Alexandria's water supply into a weapon, redirecting flows to flood Roman positions while leaving the city's reservoirs untouched. His ships, lighter and nimbler than Rome's heavy galleys, harried supply lines until Caesar's legionaries were chewing their belts for sustenance. Even more audacious was his use of misinformation. Spreading rumors that Cleopatra's younger brother Ptolemy, the nominal king, had died, Ganymedes nearly sparked a mutiny among Caesar's allied troops, who saw no reason to fight for a corpse. It was psychological warfare centuries ahead of its time, and it almost worked. The turning point came not from Caesar's brilliance, but from palace politics. Just as starvation began gnawing at Roman discipline, Cleopatra's faction staged a coup, sidelining Ganymedes in favor of her younger brother's nominal command. The reasoning: a eunuch, no matter how gifted, couldn't wield the symbolic power of a Ptolemy. overnight, the architect of Rome's torment was demoted to advisor, his authority gutted. The results were catastrophic. Without Ganymede's ruthless pragmatism, Egypt's forces floundered. Reinforcements reached Caesar, the blockade fractured, and the rest, as they say, is history. But what if Ganymedes had stayed in charge? Imagine a world where his Nile stranglehold held long enough for Caesar's enemies in Rome to rally, where the Alexandrian War became not a footnote but the end of Caesar's rise. The man who conquered Gaul might have met his match in a tutor-turned-tactician, and Cleopatra's fate indeed. Rome's could have veered in unthinkable directions. Yet Ganymedes' legacy isn't just in the battles he almost won. It's in the lesson he embodied. In an age obsessed with bloodlines and brute force, he proved that strategy could trump status, that a mind with no royal blood could outthink history's most celebrated general. That truth, perhaps, was why his successors erased him, not because he failed, but because he came too close to proving empires aren't inevitable. And though his name faded, the Nile's currents still whisper what might have been. Caecina Severus should have been a Roman legend, the general who avenged Varus's annihilation and brought Germania to heel, while Arminius's ambush in the Teutoburg forest became the stuff of nightmares. Caecina's near victory at Idistavizo was the revenge story Rome desperately needed. Picture the scene: 4 legions, still haunted by the ghosts of their slaughtered comrades, marching deep into enemy territory under a commander who refused to let fear dictate strategy. Caecina understood something Varus never did. The Germanic tribes couldn't be beaten on their own terrain with brute force alone. They had to be outthought. His masterstroke, a forced night march so audacious it's still studied in military academies today. With Arminius's forces closing in, Caecina ordered his troops to break camp under cover of darkness, not in retreat, but in a calculated gambit to reposition for dawn. Torches were left burning to deceive scouts, while the legions slipped through the forest in eerie silence. By sunrise, they'd reached the open plains of Idistavizo terrain where Roman discipline could finally shine. When Arminius attacked, expecting to catch them strung out in the woods, he found shields locked in perfect formation, javelins poised to fly. The ensuing battle was a slaughter in reverse. Germanic warriors, accustomed to ambushing fragmented columns, now faced the full might of a prepared legion. Caecina's cavalry, held in reserve until a critical moment, hammered their flanks like a smith's anvil. For the first time since Teutoburg, Rome had the upper hand. Yet the real test came days later, in the swamps of the Angravarii. Cornered and outnumbered, Caecina's forces found themselves sinking into knee-deep muck, their formations crumbling as Germanic spears rained down. This was where lesser commanders would have panicked. Instead, Caecina turned desperation into ingenuity. He ordered his men to stack their shields like bricks, creating makeshift platforms to stand on a floating fortress in the filth. When the tribes charged, they found not chaos but a bristling wall of steel. The battle devolved into a grueling stalemate, but crucially, Caecina's legions held. By the time Germanicus arrived with reinforcements, the message was clear: Rome could fight and win in Germania's heartland. So why did Tiberius, of all emperors, abandon these hard-won gains? The answer lies in cold arithmetic. Tiberius wasn't a conqueror, he was an accountant in purple. Every victory in Germania cost more than the land was worth. Legions bogged down in endless guerrilla wars, supply lines stretched to breaking. Worse, Germanicus's popularity threatened to eclipse his own. By recalling the armies and declaring the frontier secure, Tiberius traded glory for stability, leaving Arminius to his fate at the hands of rival chieftains. The irony: Caecina's tactics had proven Germania could be subdued, but without political will, even brilliance gathers dust. Rome's eagles would never fly so deep into those dark forests again, and Caesar's name, like so many on this list, faded into the footnotes of history. Yet in the mud of Idistavizo, he'd shown the world that Teutoburg wasn't an ending. It was a lesson, and for a fleeting moment, Rome had a student sharp enough to learn it. These 20 commanders stand as silent witnesses to history's cruelest irony, that brilliance alone doesn't guarantee remembrance. Their stories unravel the myth that the past belongs only to the victors. Sometimes it belongs to those who dared to think differently, only to be erased by time's selective ink. Consider how Hano the Great's naval tactics still ripple through modern maritime strategy, or how Bindusara's spy networks became the blueprint for covert operations centuries later. These weren't just warriors, they were innovators whose ideas outlived their names, buried under the weight of empires too proud to admit they'd been outmaneuvered. What's truly haunting isn't just their absence from textbooks, it's the realization that for every Chandragupta or Caesar, there might be a dozen more whose strategies were lost entirely. Imagine the siege engines designed by forgotten engineers, the diplomatic plays that reshaped borders without leaving a trace, the battles won by commanders whose names dissolved into the wind. History, after all, is a tapestry riddled with holes, and every missing thread could have changed the pattern, yet their ghosts linger in the unlikeliest places. Modern generals still study Thutmose III's maneuvers at Megiddo, while guerrilla fighters from Vietnam to the Andes unknowingly echo Viriathus's hit-and-run tactics. Even Carthagin's cold pragmatism finds echoes in today's geopolitical chess games, where survival sometimes means bending rather than breaking. These commanders didn't just fight wars, they rewrote the rules, proving that genius isn't bound by era or empire. So who's missing from your own mental roster of great leaders? Could there be a queen who defied Rome twice as fiercely as Boudicca, or a general whose tactics surpassed Hannibal's, now lost to a single crumbling scroll? The conversation doesn't end here. Drop your theories in the comments. Who knows, you might just resurrect a legend. And if you're hungry for more stories plucked from history's margins, hit that subscribe button. The ancient world is vast and its shadows are deeper than they seem. Together, let's keep pulling them into the light, one forgotten name at a time.